At this time, I would like to bring forward, and I'm honored to bring forward Dr. Nahida Gordon. She is a PhD. She is a professor emeritus of bioethics at Case Western Reserve School of Medicine and a member of the Interfaith Council for Peace in the Middle East. Her family was forced to depart Jaffa in 1948. She and her husband Donald helped lead the campaign within the National Presbyterian Church for the divestment from corporations that profit from the occupation of the West Bank. At this time, I'm calling forward Dr. Nahida Gordon.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me back there?
A little more, please.
It is a little bit daunting to tell you the story of my life and experiences in Palestine in 20 minutes, but I'll do my best.
A little louder.
First, I'd like to thank Cleveland Peace Action for giving me the opportunity to speak. So let's begin. The title of my talk is The Ongoing Nakba, 1922 to the present time. It is never stopped. It began in 1922 when Great Britain took the mandate of Palestine. For you to understand my experiences, I'd like to put it in context. And the context goes back to the First World War. I'll be brief, however. During the First World War, the Ottomans, which is the present-day Turkey, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fought against England and France, and later on in the war, the United States entered on the side of France and England. What you see here is a map of Greater Syria, and basically it encompassed what was the old land of Canaan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and the Sinai Peninsula. During the First World War, England made a pact with the Arabs, and the pact was fight with us against the Turks, who had a free range in that area. Yes, they made a pact, help us fight the Turks, they at that time had free range over the Arabian Peninsula as well as what is called Greater Syria, and we will give you freedom when the First World War is over with. They also made agreements amongst themselves, France and England, that they would divvy up the area amongst themselves. And finally, they also made an agreement with some very prominent Jews in the British establishment that they would help create a homeland for Jews in the Holy Land. This was called the Balfour Declaration, which was declared in 1917, just before the end of the First World War. Well, when the war ended, they didn't keep their promises. They were in a fix in a way. They made so many promises, they were not consistent with each other. They divided up the area, and England had what was called the Mandate of Palestine. That included what is called Transjordan and present-day Israel-Palestine. According to the League of Nations in 1922, a mandatory power was supposed to make sure that the indigenous people become well able to control their affairs. At that time, the population of Palestine was largely Muslim and Christian, 92%. The Jews in Palestine were about 8%. These Jews were longtime residents of the area, and they were they were mixed in with the population, and we all got along quite well together. Having friendships was not unusual between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. When the mandate began, Palestine was what is called the Class A mandate, had all the rights and obligations of a country just like the other countries. However, England had other plans for Palestine because of the Balfour Declaration. They facilitated the large immigration of Jews from Europe into Palestine. I will come back to this in a few minutes, and I want to concentrate my comments on Jaffa, which is where I was living when we had to leave. I was born in Jerusalem, and my father moved his family to Jaffa when I was 2 years old, which would be about 1941. Now, one of the talking points, propaganda points by some early Zionists was that Palestine was a land without any people, for a people without a land, meaning there was no one there, and the Jews of Europe needed the country, and so this was the ideal place. Well, what you see here is a colorized picture of Jaffa. We think either taken in the late 19th century or the early 20th century. As you can see, it was an urban area settled by Muslims and Christians. We didn't live in tents. We lived pretty much like the rest of you. The next picture is of what we call the Clock Tower Square. This was taken in 1914 by Masden. His collection of pictures is actually quite beautiful. As you see, the detail on there. And this was before the advent of many of the automobiles in Palestine. The reason I show this is when my father moved his business to Jaffa in 1941, he had an office in the Clock Tower Square. Here's another picture of Jaffa. This is 1922, about the time that England took the mandate. This is called the Al-Nuzha neighborhood. And I chose this picture because when we moved to Jaffa, my father rented an apartment in this neighborhood while we were waiting for the house that we were to move into would be finished. Here's another picture taken later in the 40s. What you see here is the new City Hall, or what is called the Grand Sarai. And next to it is the Al-Hamra Theater, which was built in 1933. What you see here is what the British did to the old city of Jaffa in the 30s and the 20s. They claimed that they needed a large area to put their armaments, their jeeps, their tanks, and so forth. They needed a place to maneuver. So they blew up large parts of the old city of Jaffa. And in many cases, they gave people only 12-hour notice. In some cases, the houses had people in them. This is a map of Jaffa in 1948. And I'll show you a slightly enlarged section. The purple area is the old city of Jaffa. And this is that T-shaped area that the British cleared by destroying all the homes there. My house, which I'll show you in a few minutes, is right here on the edge of the old city. And up here, I don't know if you can see this, there's a red dot, which is the church across the street, which I might mention, and this is the lighthouse, which I used to see from my bedroom at night. My school was a short 2 blocks away right here. And when I went back many times, I was astounded that school was so short distance away from home. I was never allowed to walk to school. I was always escorted by an adult or driven by a car. So in my childhood imagination, I thought school was very far away. The reason is it was dangerous on the streets. My brother told me that the Yeshuv, which were the precursor of the Zionist IDF, used to come at the foot of the street here and pepper the street with bullet fire. So my parents just couldn't let us out on the street. It was just way too dangerous. What you see here is the situation in 1947. The green area are areas that are owned by the Palestinians, Muslims, and Christians, and the white areas by Israelis, Jewish Israelis. Now, when the European Jews started coming into Palestine, their leadership never had the idea that they were going to incorporate themselves into the Palestinian society. They wanted the country for themselves. So their first aim was to get rid of the Palestinians by giving them money and asking them to relocate. They tried to make agreements with Italy to send Palestinians to Libya, or they tried to make agreements with the Ottoman Turks to send them elsewhere. It didn't work. The Palestinians, even though they were offered a large amount of money, didn't accept. So the next campaign was to buy as much land as possible, and by 1947, as you can see, they owned roughly 8 to 10% of the land. After the large immigration from Europe, by 1947, the proportion of Jewish versus Muslim and Christians was almost 33% Jewish, and the rest Christian and Muslim. When the Palestinians saw what was happening, they had a lot of uprisings. The worst one was in 1936 to 39. which was brutally put down by the British. By the way, the Israelis learned everything they do probably from the British. They learned a lot of lessons. They brutally suppressed this uprising, and when it was over with, they had killed about 5,000 Palestinians, and they either executed, put in prison, or exiled all the leadership, and they disarmed the Palestinians. The British had their fill, and they decided they wanted to leave. The United Nations recommended partition in 1947, and this is the partition plan they recommended. The blue areas were supposed to be the Israeli part, and that was 55% of the land for 33% of the population. The buff parts were supposed to be for the Palestinians, which was 45% of the land for 2/3 of the population. Basically, they decided they're going to give land from the Palestinians to the Israelis. After the partition plan, the Israelis started expelling the Palestinians, and before May, the mid-May, when they declared themselves a state, they had expelled 400,000 Palestinians and destroyed 200 villages. It was only after they declared themselves a state and President Truman recognized Israel within minutes and then later the United Nations accepted them as a member state with the proviso that they allow the refugees to return. I'm still waiting to return. It was after that that the Arab countries invaded. They were poorly armed, they were poorly trained, and incredibly disorganized, as compared to the Yishuv, or the precursor of the IDF, who were well-trained, well-armed. They had, as a matter of fact, most of the weapons left by the British as they left Palestine, and so they were victorious. And what you see here are the borders, basically, of the 1949 armistice. The pattern of forcible expulsion was pretty much the same everywhere. Depending on where the village was, if you were in the north, they would, whether the village fought against them or not, they would close 3 sides and leave a side open towards the side they wanted the villagers to flee. So if it was in the north, it was the north side of the village. If it was in the central Palestine, the eastern part, it was towards Jordan and Syria. And if it was in the south, it was towards Egypt and Gaza. Now, in Jaffa, which is where I was living, the people had very few options. A lot of them took to the sea and they went up to Lebanon or down to the Gaza. Now, another talking point by Israelis is the Arabs want to push us into the sea. It was exactly the other way around. They pushed us out to sea, and they did the same thing exactly in Haifa as they did in Jaffa. This is the way things stand right now. In 1967, the Israelis took the West Bank and Gaza. They eventually evacuated Gaza, and you know about it. That's another whole story. And right now, they're building settlements as much as they can in the West Bank, and this is what's left of the West Bank. They destroyed eventually over 500 villages and expelled about 750,000 Palestinians. To go back to my personal story, and I will finish in a few minutes, this is that Grand Sarai, or the municipal buildings picture I showed you previously. What happened is a truck loaded with oranges. Now, Jaffa was the center of the world for exporting oranges. It had explosive covered with oranges. 2 men drove up to the side of the clock tower square near the municipal building. It then exploded. There were 21 civilians killed. 17 of them were children eating in the charity kitchen on the first floor. My father was wounded in that bombing. He wasn't in a municipal building, he was in his office nearby. He had a head wound, and he came home. I remember seeing him. He had a handkerchief around his head, soaked with blood. His tie was bloody, so was his shirt. And he told us that he saved himself by jumping underneath a table. As a child, I remember that the Israelis were bombing regularly the civilian areas of Jerusalem. In the 25th of January, they hijacked a British munitions train and confiscated arms and long-range, what do you call them, things that shoot. Yes. So they used them against the population. And they started bombing. So I used to go to sleep listening to bombs. And it was sort of frightening. I could see the lighthouse. If you remember that picture of Jaffa I showed you, we're near the harbor. I could see the light of the lighthouse through the transom of my bedroom window. And it was quite a comfort. The next 3 slides, very quickly I'll show them. They're papers I found in my father's papers after he died. This is an agreement signed by the Haganah with some notables in Jaffa in May 13, 1948, just before they declared themselves a state. And they made a variety of promises. This is page 1, and the first page was an agreement, and these are the second 2 pages that show you the details of the agreement. I'd like to read to you a few parts of it. This part says, it is understood that the Haganah, that's the precursor of the IDF, always does respect and will respect the Geneva Fourth Convention and all international laws and so forth, and which is really ironic. One of the Geneva Convention clauses says several things. One of them, you can't move your people into occupied territory, and Jaffa was occupied, West Bank was occupied, and 2, you're allowed to refugees to return home. And that was, again, another proviso for admitting them into the United Nations, that you should let the refugees return, which they never did. In this detail, they say all males in the area defined in the agreement will concentrate in the area between, and I won't read it in detail, between 3 streets and the sea. During this time, any male found outside this area will be severely punished. Now, this was just a few days after we left. We left Jaffa on the 22nd of April. And if we had remained there, my brothers, who were teenagers at the time, and my father, we would have been separated from them. My mother, myself, and sister would have been helpless on our own. Another ironical thing is that they said, any male wishing to leave may apply to my representative for a permit to do so. Likewise, male Arabs who left Jaffa and who wish to return to Jaffa may apply for a permission to do so. And then they go down in number 9 and they say, all public offices, municipal and government must be kept intact so that basically if you want to return, you can prove that you were a resident of Jaffa. And then say the removal of these and the transfer of properties is illegal. Basically, that's what those things said. However, as soon as they took Jaffa, they proceeded to destroy most documents and government offices. And this is what they do regularly when they attack in a city, in Ramallah or elsewhere in the West Bank. They will destroy records. They even destroy school records. Many Palestinians have difficulty proving to you that they graduated from high school or from college because the records were destroyed. A friend of my sister who worked at my school, I'm almost finished, saved a register of the school, and I don't know if you can see this, but I'm the 4th person on there. It says my name, Nahida Halabi, born 9/19/1939. Now you know how old I am. And it says that I was a Protestant. And if you had more time to study this, you'll see that further down on, there is a Jewish student. There are lots of Muslim students. Most of them were Greek Orthodox. Now, the people of Jaffa left by sea. There weren't enough boats to leave, and they were crowded, and some of them sank. This is a painting by a woman by the name of Tamam al-Akhal. She was 14 years old in 1948, and her house was in the old city just behind ours. And in this painting, you see what she saw in Jaffa when they were leaving. A lot of people trying to get in boats, some of them capsizing, people drowning, and here you see Israeli soldiers pushing people out. Now, this is my house as it stands today, and it has gone through many different shapes, but basically the bottom part is exactly the way it was. This part right here was a veranda they built over it. I won't go into all the details. If you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them. The house now has 14 apartments in it. This is an example of apartments they put in the huge veranda behind the house where we played as children. And then finally, the last slide, this is a woman, an Israeli woman who lives in one of the apartments in my house. And we had a very nice conversation with her. She let us in, knowing who we were. She thought she was renting from the Catholic Church. We explained to her that we are the previous owners. We talked about the house and the neighborhood and Israel in general. It was a very nice visit. She had no idea about our story, and we listened very carefully to hers as well. And I'll stop right here. I'll be glad to answer questions later. Thank you.